Welcome to week 4. This week, we are discussing chapters 4 and 6 of your textbook. At the end of chapter 4, you should be able to define perception and the 3 stages of the perception process, social categorization and its impact on communication, and the influence of culture on perception. Finally, you should be able to discuss how ethnocentrism, stereotypes, prejudice, and racism influence intercultural communication. Let's start with human perception. This chapter focuses on the human perception process and the relationship between perception and culture. It describes the stages of the perception process, explains social categorization of people, and its impact on intercultural communication. The stages of the perception process. We respond to sensory stimuli by selecting, organizing, and interpreting it. This helps us make sense of our world. This process occurs in stages, with each stage involving a specific operation on incoming information. The first stage is perception, in which we use our sensory organs to identify the existence of stimuli and subject it to evaluation and interpretation. This is a subjective process and is influenced by culture, by our personal experiences, and our values. This perception process consists of 3 stages. The first stage is selection. In the selection stage, information is received through our senses, attended to, and interpreted by the brain. In the next stage, categorization, we group people, objects, and events on the basis of their perceived similarities. So we might group people together based on their skin color, their race, gender, dress, language. And finally, interpretation. This is when we attach meaning to the sensory data that we've filtered and received. We apply elements of familiarity to it, drawing upon context and knowledge that we already have to help us understand what we've processed. It's impossible to meaningfully process all available stimuli from our environment. So we have to use this process to make sense of our overly complex world. Categories have a filtering effect on perceptions, so that the mere categorization of persons into groups is sufficient to foster bias. That's why in intercultural communication, we say that social categorization is the road to bias. This leads us to the perception that we, the in-group, are who we are because they, the out-group, are not what we are. So most people have the tendency to think in terms of an in-group and out-group membership when it comes to categorizing people and to attribute in-groups and out-groups. So we typically attribute in-groups with positive, affirming qualities, while out-groups are often attributed negatively. So different cultures ascribe different meanings to in-group and out-group relationships, but across cultures, we typically maximize the advantages of the in-group, and that has implications for intercultural communication. So first, let's think about ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the tendency for people to see their own culture or their in-group as the point of reference while seeing other cultures or out-groups as insignificant or inferior. Many researchers recognize ethnocentrism as a ubiquitous phenomenon. So ethnocentrism is something that we should recognize as one of these challenges to successful intercultural communication. So if low ethnocentrism is typified by a desire to reduce a communicative distance between in-groups and out-groups, that helps us communicate better with people from other cultures, right? Whereas high ethnocentrism, which is characterized by distance between in and out groups and an insensitivity or disregard for other perspectives, that's going to make intercultural communication more difficult. And high ethnocentrism may lead to prejudice, stereotypes, or discrimination. So let's talk about stereotypes. Stereotypes are preconceived beliefs about the characteristics of certain groups based on physical attributes or social status that may not be generalizable to all members of the group. Stereotypes often form the basis of prejudice, which is a negative attitude toward individuals resulting from stereotypes, and constitutes generalized evaluations about a person, object, or action that are the result of individual experience, interpersonal communication, or media influence. So stereotypes are these preconceived beliefs about a group. So if you go into a communication interaction with a group and you have these preconceived notions about what that group is going to be like, that is a stereotype. And that stereotype has the power to create prejudice, which is prejudice is the result of generalized evaluations about a person, object, or action that manifests in biased attitudes or behaviors towards the relevant party. So stereotypes and prejudice are developed through socialization with the mass media, with your in-group members. So think about how the media plays a role in prejudice that you may hold. Now let's move on to talking about racism. Racism refers to the belief that some racial groups are superior and that other racial groups are necessarily inferior. This superiority is believed to be biological, and on this basis, that cultural, intellectual, moral, and social superiority are consequences. So this is when you believe that your in-group is superior culturally, intellectually, morally, socially, on all of these categories. Racism is usually the product of ignorance, fear, and hatred. And it reflects and is perpetuated by deeply rooted historical, social, cultural, and power inequalities in a society. So clearly, stereotypes, prejudice, and racism create barriers to intercultural communication. So chapter 4 really starts for us to think about how ethnocentrism, stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination impedes successful intercultural communication. In chapter 6, we're going to talk more about identity, more about identities and subgroups. Specifically, we're going to define identity, explain characteristics of identity, and talk about some theory. So this chapter concentrates on identities and subgroups. It defines identities at individual and collective levels, and starts to talk about theory. So our group memberships can be voluntary or involuntary. We categorize and are categorized based on these memberships, as we talked about, in groups and out groups. So define identity. Identity is a person's subjective experience of themselves in relation to the world. So this is formed through cultural processes, and this gives you your sense of place in the world. Identity can be individual or collective. So your individual identity, also known as a personal identity, refers to your individual self-image that makes the person distinct from others who are similar in some way. And your social identity or your collective identity refers to those parts of an individual's self-concept which drive from their membership in a group. And this collective identity is what gives you your in and out group membership. So those collective identities and individual identities can be voluntary or involuntary. So think about which are voluntary and which are involuntary. So for instance, being a student at KU, being a Jayhawk is probably a voluntary identity. Social identity theory, which we'll spend a whole week talking about, claims that identity formation is a product of social categorization. So social identity theory talks about that collective identity level. And it says that social identities or collective identities connect individuals to society through group membership, which influences their beliefs, attitudes, and behavior in relationships with members of other social groups. And you can continue to think about cultural identity, national identity. So social categorization, as we've talked about, refers to the grouping of people based on all different kinds of things: skin color, dress, language, occupation, school you go to. And these groups exist within the larger cultural environment and can often be called as subgroups. Subgroups provide members with relatively complete values and patterns of behavior. Your textbook talks about several different subgroups. Your textbook talks a lot about gender, ethnic subgroups, religious subgroups. So think about subgroups that you all belong to and that are meaningful for your identity. So we've started to talk about in-groups and out-groups, and we'll continue to do that as we talk about social identity theory. And these are also in your textbook sometimes referred to as membership groups and non-membership groups. So for an individual in any culture, there are groups that they belong to called membership groups or in-groups, and groups that they don't belong to, out-groups. So an in-group represents a special class of membership characterized by internal cohesiveness among members. And an in-group has norms, values, just like a culture. And an out-group is a group whose attributes are dissimilar from those of the in-group. And as we continue to talk about barriers to effective intercultural communication, remember that our appearance, our values, our subgroups all reveal who we are and influence our communication with others. Identity conflicts may arise in intercultural situations if one is not treated in the same way they would expect due to their ethnic, gender, racial, or cultural identities. So effective and appropriate intercultural communication requires both the openness to culturally different others and the willingness to negotiate differences. So think about that attitudinal multiculturalism. And Milton Bennett came up with this developmental model of intercultural sensitivity as a way to explain the reactions of people to cultural difference. And this framework is based on his observation that individuals confront cultural difference in some predictable ways as they learn to become more competent intercultural communicators. And this outlines 6 stages, moving from ethnocentric, which characterize the first 3 stages, to ethno-relative, which characterizes the last 3 stages. And this framework has been used in constructing a competent intercultural identity that aims at understanding other cultures in their wholeness. So individuals who acquire this identity are willing to negotiate differences, able to reach intercultural agreements, want to integrate diverse cultural elements, and wish to achieve identity extension. So effective intercultural communication requires awareness and openness to culturally different others, and a willingness to abandon stereotypes, prejudice, and ethnocentrism. So we'll continue to think about this DMIS model the whole semester and how these barriers to effective intercultural communication can be stripped from our perception process. So this is chapters 4 and 6 of your textbook. Continue to think about barriers as you think more about verbal, nonverbal communication, and more about contexts of intercultural communication.